We have a very exciting next session planned. Today I have the privilege of introducing two leaders who have been a real voice on American elections and election administration. Former Senator Roy Blunt and Senator Amy Klobuchar are going to be joining us for a fireside chat today. Senator Roy Blunt began his long career in public service as the county clerk and chief election official in Greene County, Missouri at age 23. He then went on to become Missouri's Secretary of State, where he oversaw statewide elections. He did represent his home state for nearly 30 years as a United States representative and senator, and he is now an executive fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Senator Amy Klobuchar needs no introduction, but she has been a champion for Minnesota and bipartisan governance since she took office in 2007. She's been on the front line of election policy at the federal level, especially when it comes to funding, election official protection, and the impact of artificial intelligence on elections. She serves as the chair of the Committee on Rules and Administration, and in 2021, she introduced the Freedom to Vote Act to protect and expand voters' access to the ballot, among other provisions. She's also an advocate for the safety of election workers. Today's conversation will be moderated by BPC's Matt Weil, who is Executive Director of our Democracy Program. We are very thankful to have Senator Klobuchar and former Senator Blunt here today, and I will welcome them onto the stage now.
Well, thank you, Rachel, for the introduction. My name is Matthew Weil, and I am the Executive Director of the Democracy Program at the Bipartisan Policy Center. I can't really overstate how excited I am to be up here with two senators who I've long admired and with whose staffs I've been able to work with over the past decade. I'm going to really jump right into this because I know we only have a very short period of time with Senator Klobuchar. So my goal for this fireside chat, and I want you all to imagine a roaring, crackling, warm fire right here behind Senator Klobuchar, is to focus on those opportunities for bipartisan election improvements that secure the voting process and ensure accessibility for all eligible voters. I have way more questions than we have time for, so I'm going to jump into it. Senator Klobuchar, from your perspective, what do you see as the most challenging election policy issues facing the new Congress, and what is the path forward for moving balanced bipartisan reforms?
We have no challenges. No, I mean, but I did want to say thank you for hosting this, Matthew, and Roy and I miss Roy every single day. We did so much work together and had a lot of fun doing it, which is key.
Did.
The Electoral Reform Act reforms after January 6th and the work that had to be done so that couldn't be used, this old archaic law that was passed before the prequel to Yellowstone was not used again as some kind of a trigger, and felt those were really, really smart reforms. We worked on all kinds of things during the pandemic and with the election. And most significantly, we resolved the baby on the floor issue.
Sure.
When Tammy Duckworth wanted to bring her baby on the floor. And somehow I remember Mitch to go over and say hi to the baby. He didn't need to kiss it, which I said he didn't need to do.
He's not a natural baby kissing.
No, not at all. And mostly we were, as Roy would tell you, like the mayors of the Senate. And so dealt with a lot of things we can't disclose, including like what senator wanted a squirrel as a pet that we had to turn down. That led to a lot of trust in our work and work on elections. And Roy, as a former Secretary of State, was really helpful on that front as well. And so a lot of our focus was on election security and making sure that the states had the funding they needed. And that is a bipartisan area, continues to be for our both volunteer election officials, which we always want to recruit. We had several hearings on that, as well as our elected and their staff in each state, because they are still on the front line. And I would be remiss not to mention the tragedy of our Minnesota CEO for United Healthcare, Brian Thompson, who I personally know, who was gunned down in New York outside of their investor conference or leaving for it. It's just a horrific situation. And I only bring it up in this context because there is just a lot of, whatever the cause of this was or whoever the murderer was, there is just a lot of anger at people who run things right now. And whether it is a business or whether it is in politics. And I always think about that with these election officials who, especially in rural areas, are just sitting out there by themselves and people are mad and they come up to vote. So that has been a lot of our work. We also have right now, the AI involvement in campaigns, and Roy has blissfully missed this part of the chapter of elections, but I hope eventually that is an area of bipartisan work because we have seen it in a very big way bipartisan in the states. 18 states now have passed some state laws that say you have to have labeling if it is the use of AI. And I'm not talking about hair color or little things here, but where it actually makes you think it's the person or it's something that is pretty misleading. And just putting the words on digitally altered when it's not AI, prepared by AI, can make a major difference. We saw this in the New Hampshire primary with the fake voice of Joe Biden telling people not to vote, which turned out to be an outside consultant and a magician who then came forward. They should have hired a mime, but whatever. Okay, so we saw it in the Republican primary with a fake video of our future president, President Trump, hugging Fauci. That was a lie. We saw it in a governor's race in Indiana where someone took a photo of a actual rally of one of the candidates where they just had the campaign signs and replaced them with no gas stove signs and then put it in an ad that was then had to be taken down because Indiana actually had passed a bipartisan law that said that things had to be labeled, and then they eventually withdrew the thing. I've had it personally with right after 3 police officers were killed in Minnesota. It was a total horrible, horrible thing. A picture went up, which was originally a true picture of me, and Keith Ellison was in it, who's a very big focus of people on social media. And it was just a picture at one of his rallies in everyone's way. They had no signs at all. They put defund the police signs in the participants' hands, and it started to go viral right after the officers were killed. We actually got immediately X and Meta put a digitally altered, they wouldn't take it down, but digitally altered, and then that eventually made it go away. But it is just an example. I lead the bill on the cops funding, right? I was completely against defund. But that thing, if we wouldn't have called, I just don't know how much more it would have gone viral in our state. And so those things are happening right now. So what does that go to federally? And then I'll turn it over to Roy. Is just this idea that we should have, there's 2 ways to go, and you can do both together. Texas and Minnesota, very different political cultures, have actually banned deepfakes, the ones that they're not satire, that wouldn't be allowed, but they have actually banned those. And Minnesota has done it the same. So the 2 bills that I have, one is with Josh Hawley, there you go, and Susan Collins. So it kind of spans the 2, ban the deepfakes when they will materially, deceptive, some very defined language approved by Democratic and Republican lawyers. The second one is with Lisa Murkowski, which would require the labeling. So if we don't do this with federal elections, and it was, my guess, tame compared to how it's going to be 2 years from now, we're going to have no rules at all for these elections, and you will not know if it's a candidate you love or the candidate you do not like. And so that's some of the solutions on that front, as well as continuing to fund our election agencies.
So Senator Blunt, what do you think Congress is going to focus on?
Well, it's easier for me to think about what Congress should focus on now. I didn't want to say I'm here. I'm glad to be here with Amy. So 3 years, 11 months, and a day or so ago, we walked out of the Capitol together on the early morning of January the 7th at about 3:48 with the Vice President, and it was a really tragic moment for the whole example of peaceful transition of power. And then 2 weeks after that, we were together on the platform conducting President Biden's inauguration, and I'd been in charge of President Trump's inauguration 4 years earlier. I think, everybody one side's always happier after the election than the other side, whether it's the inauguration or the day after the election. I think we actually did get lucky this time that the result was fairly decisive. And in fact, I told several people within the month before the election.
Speak for yourself.
There's usually, well, I think I'm right on this.
I'm kidding.
There's usually some movement at the end where things happen that somebody wins a lot more of these states than others. There aren't that many to win. You know, when George W. Bush was elected president in 2000, there were 30 battleground states. Now 7. They all happen to go one way. So we missed the divisive moment that where our outside adversaries could have very easily been confusing people again about the unfairness of the counting. The easiest deep fake in the world to do would be a nondescript room with people you don't recognize who are shredding ballots and things like that. I did some work in the last few months with the DNI on this, the Director of National Intelligence on this topic. And I think our biggest concern was not as much what would happen before the election, but what our adversaries might do after the election. And of course, all of that makes the job of election officials and essentially volunteers, the thousands and thousands of volunteers that conduct the election across the country, that much harder. I'd start by saying, one, we need to do everything we can to sort of bring the temperature down in ways we can. I was a county election official one time. I was the Secretary of State, the chief election official for 8 years, and I'd conduct these worker sessions, and I'd say, okay, there are 2 of you for every job. And one reason there are 2 of you for every job is you're supposed to watch each other. But the other reason there are 2 of you for every job is you're supposed to protect each other by doing what you're supposed to do and being able to say at the end of the day that your fellow election worker doing that same job did what they were supposed to do. So to try to get back to that, to try our best to create a sense of safety in a relatively unsafe society still would be important. I've never been an advocate for major federal changes in the election law. I think one that makes it even less likely that election workers show up who are your traditional workers. And 2, I think it makes less likely that people will have confidence in what's happening locally if it's somehow directed from Washington, D.C. It's one of the few things we've had a little give and take on over time, but I don't see that changing in the near future. I think we're going to continue to have state election laws run by state officials. I think those state officials are much better connected with the federal intelligence system than they used to be, or even than they were 4 years ago. Much better this time, where you find out what might be happening in your state that affects your voter rolls or your voter equipment. Things like people understanding that in almost all jurisdictions now there's a piece of paper that is a traceable ballot trail that no matter how you counted your votes, you could always go back and take those same ballots and count them in some other way. So I hope we can begin to see the temperature down. We've had the longest period of near parity in our politics that we've had since right after the Civil War. In the last 26 elections, the last 26 years, the last 13 elections, either the House, the Senate, or the White House have changed 11 times. And sometimes it was multiples of that, but there's no comparable period. So part of the increased temperature is the idea that anybody could win at any election, and that won't last forever. We have a little break here that there's no big challenge to what happened election day, and the more transparent local officials can be, the more both political parties can be involved in every jurisdiction in a way that, again, not only they watch each other, but more importantly, they verify. We were both there for the test of the ballot counting equipment. We were both there for this. Those are important things that I think help bring the temperature down, and we should be pretty focused on what we need to do to do that. And every election official, of course, needs to have a very good dialogue with both sides in every election. And I think our election officials around the country do a pretty good job of doing that.
So can I bring that out a little bit more? This room is filled today with election officials, with academics, with civil society leaders. You've been an election official, as you mentioned,
Right.
local and state. What would be your advice to them to kind of work together to bring about the bipartisan reforms that they all know are important?
Well, the reforms, I do think most of that's going to happen at the state level. I think a lot of states have worked really hard to be sure that their laws are more transparent. I kept hearing before the election, the Secretary of State of Georgia was saying something like, we're going to have a fair, free, and fast election. I do think the fast election part is a pretty important part of that. If you're still in a state that can't figure out how to count the ballots within 24 hours of election day, my advice would be do everything you can to get the legislature to clarify the law in a way that happens. Pennsylvania did a much better job. They made a big investment. They didn't change their law. They did a much better job this time than last time. But we're still counting ballots in California and Arizona a month after the election. There is no excuse for that. And if the problem is you accept absentee ballots too long, you ought to think at your state legislative level, why do all the other states manage to get this done by election day, and in our state, we're doing it a month later? I think nothing creates concern and skepticism about the election more than some states counting weeks after the election's over. And I would be working hard to get those state laws changed in those states where that's not the result. Everybody else has figured out how to do it some other way. And the states that are way behind on this should not continue to be behind.
I would agree with this in that I did a report 4 years ago now. Some states had improved their laws. Michigan improved it some with when they would start counting earlier, the ones that came in early, or at least open them up. Pennsylvania doesn't even open them up. Am I right, guys?
That's right.
And I mean, I was just like, come on. And it's not always just a blue state or a red state thing. Some of the red states, they just don't happen to be swing states, so that people aren't focused on it enough. And so I just think doing everything we can to get things fair but counted, and we're always going to have close elections. I'm looking at State Senator Steve Carlson here from Minnesota, the Frank and Coleman U.S. Senate race, where it was, 300 some votes or something. So the point where when Franken won, he could go into rooms and say, I wouldn't have won without you. And I mean it. Senator Coleman handled that, I believe, well. It went on for a while because it was so close, the recount, but then he acknowledged the results. And we were actually, it was quite extraordinary how we got through that time period in our state. And it was a lot of good people on both sides of the aisle and how they handled it. But this delay just makes people not believe things. And that doesn't mean that you have to make it harder to vote. Our state has the highest voter turnout in the United States. I think you're going to see that again. And we do it not with all mail-ins. We do it with a big combination of big time voting on election day and getting in making it easier to register and all of these things. So that's the first point. Second point I would just make that I didn't make before is that I just think that Roy's right about local electeds, and that's where it's at, and that's where trust is. But there are some threats to all of this, and that I know you, having served on the Intelligence Committee, would agree that there is no way a local election official in Fargo, North Dakota is going to be able to deal with some cybersecurity thing that happened from Russia. So there is a lot of work that has to be done on that cybersecurity level. It has been done through several administrations now.
Much better than it was. No
Right,
question.
and it has to continue to be done. We're always going to have to be upgrading and getting the funding for that, because they're not going to be able to deal with that at a local level. It is part of the beauty of our system that we're decentralized. So if they attack, one state system in some way, that's horrible, but we have other states that we're voting. So that part of it is probably helpful to us, that we're not on one big national system, but we have to continue to invest in that cybersecurity. It's nothing we can just go, oh, we're safe now, it's gone away. When we continue to have these threats that have been documented, The last threat that's very hard to deal with at the local level is kind of what I love with it's misinformation. It is not all AI, and this is a much bigger issue about the platforms and liability and what we're going to do when this stuff comes up that people are seeing that is simply untrue, and labeling of ads and things that are not on TV. Duh, when most voters are getting their information from other sources, that we really have to look at that ecosystem, what's happening there. I'm just looking at, certainly on the attacks from foreign nations, that has bipartisan support. The misunderstanding, the misinformation, and the platforms, that has tended to have bipartisan support, but it's not everybody. And so that's a very confusing area to walk into. But I'm sure Elon Musk will solve all of it. No, I'm kidding. So I really believe that that is going to be messing around with our election system like you wouldn't believe, and is doing it in other countries right now.
Great. So earlier this year, the Bipartisan Policy Center released a report on election official turnover, which showed a 20-year trend, increasing trend of election officials leaving the job. And it's really indicated by two main factors. It's increased public hostility and threats towards election officials, and the increased complexity of the role of being an election official. One of the main recommendations of our report was that election officials need stable and secure funding both from state and federal sources. So do you think it's possible, Senator Klobuchar, that we get federal funding from this Congress over the next cycle? And if it's possible, what are the issues and frames for election officials to go to Congress with that request?
Well, I think I listed some of them, right? Especially the outside threats and what that means. And then, of course, the threats of violence. And Senator McConnell will be, from most accounts, taking over the Rules Committee that I chair. You know, I'm going to have a big transition meeting because he doesn't know anything about the Senate. No, I'm kidding.
Right. Exactly.
And he certainly is interested in election law, and Roy could speak to this more, but I do hope both with the appropriators that make do a lot of work on the budget, but the Rules Committee has played a role. I know Roy and I together advocated during the pandemic for more help for state election officials because of the unique needs at that moment in time. But I hope that continues because there are really some good arguments to be made here when it comes to safety. And I'm here not talking about disease, I'm talking about actual acts of violence, and then recruiting people and how important that is, and then these cyber attacks that can happen at the very local level. So those are some of the things that I think will be helpful.
I think that's right. The cyber areas, the monitoring that only the Intel Committee can do as well as they do it, but more importantly, the sharing of that is critical. You know, these are expenses that states and counties have and jurisdictions have, but they're expenses they've had a long time. You know, the federal government can't pay for everything with money that we don't have. And I wouldn't expect that to happen. You know, normally the federal elections on election day are on top of the state elections that are scheduled on the same calendar, the same time. If the federal government was holding elections all by itself, maybe some responsibility to just handle the basic needs of having the election. I think it's important that we have these levels of government, and different levels of government have different things that they're responsible for. The more money you get, the more interference you get. But I do think the money with equipment, we made money available for equipment, made money available for security. The basic conduct of the elections is going to continue to have to be paid for by states, and in most places by counties. You know, the states take advantage of the counties, and the counties take advantage, and the federal government takes advantage of the states. But it's long been a local responsibility, and you've got to elect a lot of local officials anyway, and usually you do that on the same date. Can't be that much trouble to elect a couple of members of Congress and two senators every 6 years, and a president every 4. But I do think there are things we can do, and I think we've both worked hard to see that some of those things have gotten a lot better in terms of equipment and assistance that's beyond the local and even the state level.
And as we go into this next year, which is going to be, you know, a new administration, there's a lot of talk about the budget. I do think tying some of these election funding, especially on the cyber area, to our defense and our defense of our democracy, because there's a lot of interest in funding defense through with some of my colleagues, understandably. But we got to make the argument that in modern warfare, there's a lot of going into trying to undermine democracies and undermine elections. And this isn't just with our country, right? All over the place when you look at what's some of the threats from foreign entities to try to influence democracy. So I do think it's one of the arguments we can make on cybersecurity for the continual funding that will bring in many of our Republican colleagues and some of the administration officials.
So as is the case with every election, we're going to figure out how to adapt to the new dynamics going forward.
Yeah, that was, yeah.
So I do want to...
See, I adapted.
You adapted.
Whoop. I'm also chairing the inauguration.
Exactly. What strategies do you recommend?
I adapt.
What strategies do you recommend stakeholders use to continue building the cross-partisan coalitions that could be successful, though?
Just genuine friendships, I think, makes a big difference.
How do we scale that?
Scale.
How do we scale that up?
Elect nice people. No, okay, no, go ahead.
Well, part of it is getting back to honoring the job that government does. You know, so much of government, politics now is about being in the fight rather than doing the job. And frankly, it attracts a different kind of candidate, a different kind of office holder, and looking for ways to honor the job, both those of you who are election officials, to look for how you honor the job of all these essentially volunteers that come in just a few times a year, and sometimes not even that in a given year, to make democracy possible, but also trying to, you know, honor those levels of communication with all the people you need to work with. When I was the whip in the House, I used to tell new freshman members that you're going to enjoy this a lot more and get along a lot better here if you realize that the other side, if you just convince yourself that the other side is as well motivated as you are. You can be wrong without being evil. And, you know, looking at people for who they are, trying to continue to wrap your arms around the people you work with and the people that you work for in a way that creates that level of confidence. You know, a lot of local election officials are elected, so they have this very unusual responsibility of being both a player and a referee at the same time. And frankly, almost all of them have figured out over the years a masterful way to do that. And just continuing to master that skill of developing confidence, frankly, in yourself, the institution, how you do the job, and appreciation for the people that are out there making democracy happen is really important.
And I think just along those lines, having staff that believes, I've noticed Elizabeth, our staff director from Rules, who's done FARA, Steve Spalding next to her, who works very well with Senator Blunt's staff and then Senator Fisher's staff over the years. And I just think that makes a difference as well. And I just want to end this thing with one Roy Blunt story, because we know each other's stories so well. We can tell them, but it gets to what Roy was just talking about, and that is that he always had this bust, this figure in his office, a statue, and it was called the Unknown Cleric, because he worked so hard, right, to figure out who this guy was, and never could. Library of Congress, they all tried to figure out, couldn't figure it out. And so the story he would tell when people that senators, kids that came to his office, school groups, he said, this guy was so important. How many years was it ago?
Probably put in the Capitol in the 1830s, and by the 1930s, nobody had any idea who it was.
Right, so his point is, this guy was so important. They knew he was a cleric because what he was wearing. He was so important back then that they made this bust and put all this money into this statue, and now no one knows who he is. And so his point to all of us is what matters is what you do, because they're probably not going to remember who you are 100 years from now. What matters is what you do.
What we do here is more important than who we are.
Well, I can't end that any
It's a big
better.
thing to continue.
I hope you will all join me in thanking our senators for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
All right, I think everyone in this room knows that the election isn't over on election day and still isn't over today. So our next speaker, our last speaker before lunch, is going to be BPC's own Michael Thorning. He is going to talk to us today about the post-election milestones, those kind of key dates that have to be passed after the election, as well as how the Electoral Count Reform Act impacted post-election processes.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. I was a little concerned that it would be a tough act to follow, Senators Klobuchar and Blunt, and it will be, but also cognizant that they've actually set this discussion up really well. So we'll just start to go through here. But how do we get from Election Day, which many of the people in this room spent a lot of time preparing for and are still working on, some states have just finished working on, how do we get from there to the inauguration? And really what we're asking ourselves is, how do we translate 50 state plus the District of Columbia elections into 538 electoral college votes that are counted in Congress, and then a president is declared? So just some background here. Now, when we thought about this as a panel for the summit, I think we were concerned that perhaps this would be a little bit more of a fraught time for the electoral count process. But as the last panel discussed, because of the nature of the outcome of the election, there does seem to be less pressure, fortunately, this time around on our electoral count. But we have the U.S. Constitution, federal law, state law, and then something that really came up a lot in 2020 was just various congressional rules, precedents, orders, and norms. So one thing I really want to just point out, and particularly the point of this panel, the Electoral Count Reform Act, which Senators Blunt and Klobuchar were just instrumental in getting across the finish line. I've seen a lot of friends and people in this room who were a big part of getting that law passed, but enough cannot be said about how difficult of a process and how instrumental those two senators were in getting across the finish line. There were many times when we thought it was not going to happen, and they were a big part of keeping that on track. So here's just a little bit of an outline of key dates, to just give you the overall view of how this process works. In case you're wondering where we are, we're still in this canvassing and certification period. And so there's a number of key dates over the next few weeks that are going to be very important to pay attention to. The most significant one that's coming up on about a week from today is the deadline for states to issue their certificates of ascertainment of election. And so a little bit of just the civics remedial here. Remember that on election day, you are electing electors who are going to vote for candidates in the Electoral College. And so what needs to happen a week from today is that state executives are just going to issue, here we have an example from Arizona, they're going to issue some sort of certificate that says, these are the electors who were elected in the election. Those are then transmitted to the Archivist of the United States. And a really important aspect of the Electoral Count Reform Act that was passed after 2020 was creating a new one very clear legal venue and expedited judicial procedure for challenges to those certificates to be heard. Before 2020, actually before 2022, there was a lot of uncertainty around how that process would actually work if it needed to be used. The next, and probably the most significant next moment in the process will be the meeting and vote of the electors in their states. Again, just sort of continuing here with the example of the Arizona. This is one of their votes, which after the electors vote, they send this into Washington. They signed multiple versions of this. And again, eventually what's going to happen is officials here in Washington are going to want to cross-check this vote with the certificates of who was elected that they received previously and make sure that those are all the same people. December 25th for this year, this is the deadline for all of these electoral votes to be received here in Washington. They are sent to the President of the Senate, which again, civics remedial, is also the Vice President of the United States. They are also sent to the Archivist of the United States. And if anyone's interested in seeing what the certificates and votes look like, the Archivist actually maintains them. They're available online for the most part in recent elections. And if you've ever heard about, so we have some of these issues of fake electors have been sent in, not just in 2020, in elections prior to that. The Archivist also has those, which are kind of interesting to see. And then, the moment that, Senator Blunt and Senator Klobuchar were a huge part of is the actual counting of these votes in Congress. That takes place on January 6th after every presidential election. In 2020, Senators Blunt and Klobuchar were some of the tellers. There were 4 tellers. Their job is, as the votes are being opened up in Congress, they're doing the actual counting. And so what is happening here is really that process for the first time of all of the results from across the country being brought together in terms of the Electoral College, since we know we don't have a popular vote. There have been some major changes that Senator Blunt and Klobuchar were instrumental in accomplishing in the last or 2 Congresses ago. One was a clarification of the vice president's role. You might remember from 2020 there was some confusion and disagreement about whether the vice president had any unilateral authority to act either on procedure or on the counting or not counting of states' electoral votes. It's now clear as crystal in law that the vice president has a purely ministerial role that day. It also increased the threshold for members of Congress to raise an objection. Previously, it required only 1 member of the House and 1 member of the Senate to object to a certain state's electors or their electoral votes. And you can go back and watch. In 2016, this was a hurdle that actually Democrats could not get over. Several times, members of the House raised objections about the 2016 election. Then Vice President Joe Biden inquired about whether they had a senator who was seconding the objection. They did not, and this went on for a bit before then Vice President Biden, just said to Democrats, it's over. And then the next thing that the law did was really important, was to define more clearly what permissible objections were. Before, the law was pretty open and vague about what someone could object to that day. The way the process unfolds, the certificates are open for each state in alphabetical order. You can watch this on C-SPAN. They'll go through, they'll open them, they'll announce where the electors for that state went, and then the tellers are counting them. As the 12th Amendment made clear, that the person with the greatest votes for president becomes president, and the person with the greatest votes for vice president becomes vice president. And at that point, once there's a clear majority of votes, it's essentially a foregone conclusion. It's deemed that person is declared the president. And then obviously we have inauguration day following that. And so, this is kind of a brief overview, reminder. Obviously, things are not as Senator Blunt mentioned, things are not as tense around this counting process as they were 4 years ago, but I think a lot of that has to do with the significant changes that were made to clarify the law and to prevent and really head off some of the problems that were created last time.